My mother-in-law mocked my weight, job, and looks at every dinner for 6 months and disguised it as teasing. So I started to respond with dead silence. When I first married Jake, I thought I'd hit the lottery with his family. His dad was this quiet guy who loved woodworking, his sister Amy was hilarious, and his mom Linda seemed like this warm, welcoming woman who kept saying how happy she was Jake found someone. The first few family dinners were great. I'd bring dessert, we'd all laugh about Jake's terrible cooking phase in college, and Linda would tell embarrassing stories about all her kids equally. It felt like I'd gained this whole bonus family. Then about 3 months after the wedding, something shifted. It started small at Sunday dinner when Linda looked at my plate and said, "Wow, someone's hungry today. Better slow down, or Jake won't be able to afford feeding you." Everyone laughed uncomfortably while I sat there confused because I'd taken the same amount as everyone else. Jake squeezed my hand under the table but didn't say anything. The next week, she commented on my dress, saying it was brave of me to wear something so tight when I was retaining water. I wasn't retaining anything. That was just my body. Amy changed the subject, but the damage was done. Every single dinner became Linda's personal roast session with me as the target. She'd joke about my job at the bank being so easy a trained monkey could do it. She'd laugh about how Jake must really love me to look past my cooking since she'd raised him with actual taste. When I got my hair cut, she said I was brave for choosing a style that made my face look rounder. The worst part was she'd always follow up with "Just kidding, honey. You know I love you," which made everyone else act like I was being sensitive if I looked upset. Jake would tell me later that's just how his mom showed affection, through teasing. But she never teased anyone else like that. Amy's weight gain was off limits. His dad's bald spot was never mentioned. Even Jake's recent work struggles were handled with kid gloves. But me? Fair game, apparently. For 6 months, I tried different approaches. I laughed along, which made her jokes get meaner. I tried joking back once, and she actually got tears in her eyes and said she couldn't believe I'd be so cruel when she was just being playful. Jake had to apologize to her for me. I tried talking to Jake about it seriously, but he said his mom had always been like this, and I should take it as a sign she was comfortable with me. The breaking point was my birthday dinner. Linda made this whole show of bringing out a cake, and then announced to everyone that she'd gotten the sugar-free kind since I'd been looking a little puffy lately, and birthdays aren't worth diabetes. Then she laughed about how at least I was young enough that my metabolism might still kick in eventually. His dad actually winced. Amy left the room. Jake just stared at his plate. That's when I decided I was done playing Linda's game. The next Sunday, Linda made her first joke about my promotion at work, saying at least they promoted my looks since they couldn't promote my brain. I just stared at her. No smile, no laugh, no response. Just dead eye contact. Then I turned to Amy and asked about her new apartment. Linda looked confused but jumped into the conversation. 5 minutes later, she tried again, joking about my parking job outside. Same thing, stare, silence, turn to someone else, start new conversation. It was like she didn't exist when she was being cruel. At first, she got louder, thinking I didn't hear her. Then she started repeating her jokes. Then she'd actually tap my shoulder and say, "Did you hear what I said?" I'd look at her blankly and then ask Jake's dad about his woodworking project. The whole family noticed immediately. Amy started jumping in faster to change subjects. Jake's dad began talking over Linda's jokes. Even Jake finally started seeing the pattern because the silence made it so obvious. Without my forced laughter or hurt reactions, Linda's jokes just hung there in the air, nasty and pointed and mean. She looked pathetic trying to get my attention for her punchlines. After 3 weeks of this, Linda pulled Jake aside and said I was being rude and ignoring her. Jake actually told her that she only seemed to notice when I didn't respond to her jokes and maybe she should think about that. She tried switching tactics, being extra sweet to me hoping I'd engage. But the second she made a mean joke, back to silence. The best part was Thanksgiving. Extended family was there and Linda tried her usual routine, making a joke about my family not being able to visit because they probably couldn't afford it. 20 relatives watched me stare at her in complete silence for 5 full seconds before I turned to Jake's cousin and asked about her new baby. Linda's sister actually whispered, "What the hell was that about?" Linda's face went red, and I watched her try to recover while the whole table went quiet. Amy got up to help clear plates, and Linda's sister followed her into the kitchen. I heard them talking in low voices while I stayed at the table with everyone else. Jake reached over and squeezed my hand under the table, and for once it felt like he was on my side instead of trying to smooth things over. His dad cleared his throat and started asking Jake's cousin about her baby, and the conversation slowly started up again without Linda at the center of it. In the kitchen, Amy was loading plates into the dishwasher when Sienna closed the door behind them. Amy told me later that Sienna didn't waste time with small talk. She asked Amy straight out what was going on between Linda and me, why I'd given her sister that look, why the whole table had gotten so tense. Amy put down the plate she was holding and just started talking. She told Sienna everything. 6 months of jokes about my weight, my job, my appearance. How Linda never said anything mean about Amy or Jake or anyone else, just me. How she'd make these cutting comments and then laugh and say she was just teasing. How I'd tried everything to make it stop, laughing along, joking back, talking to Jake, but nothing worked until I started the silent treatment. Sienna's face got harder with every detail Amy shared. She asked why nobody had said anything to Linda, why the family just let it happen. Amy admitted she'd been uncomfortable but didn't know how to call out her own mother without causing a huge fight. Sienna shook her head and said that wasn't teasing, that was bullying, and she couldn't believe her sister had been treating her new daughter-in-law that way for months, while everyone just watched. Back at the table, Linda came back from wherever she'd gone to pull herself together. She sat down and didn't make any more jokes for the rest of dinner. She kept glancing at me like she was waiting for me to do something, say something, give her some kind of reaction she could work with. I just ate my pie and talked to Jake's cousin about baby sleep schedules. Every time Linda opened her mouth like she might try another joke, Sienna would look at her with this expression that made Linda close her mouth again. Other relatives started noticing something was off. Jake's uncle asked if everything was okay, and Linda said everything was fine in this tight voice that made it clear nothing was fine. Sienna rolled her eyes so obviously that Jake's aunt saw it and raised her eyebrows. Linda tried twice more before dessert was over. She made a comment about how I must work out a lot to eat so much pie, and I just stared at her while Sienna shook her head in disapproval. Then she laughed about how my car was parked crooked outside, and maybe I needed glasses, and I turned to Amy and asked about her new apartment while Sienna actually rolled her eyes where everyone could see. By the time people started leaving, half the extended family knew something weird was happening, but nobody knew exactly what. After everyone left, Caleb asked if I wanted to see his latest project in the garage. Jake started to come with us, but his dad said he wanted to show me something specific, just the two of us. We walked out to the garage and he turned on the light over his workbench. He had this beautiful cabinet he was building, all these careful joints and smooth wood. He ran his hand over it and didn't say anything for a minute. Then he told me he was sorry. He said he'd watched Linda make those jokes for months, and he'd sat there like a coward and let it happen. He said he kept telling himself it wasn't his business, that Linda was just being Linda, that I seemed to be handling it fine. But watching me give her the silent treatment at Thanksgiving made him realize how cruel she'd been. Without my forced laughter or hurt reactions, the jokes just hung there and sounded as mean as they actually were. He said he felt ashamed that it took me refusing to play along for him to finally see what his wife was doing to me. I told him I appreciated him saying that. He nodded and showed me how the cabinet doors were going to work, and we stayed out there for a while talking about wood grain and finishes instead of his wife's behavior. Jake was quiet on the drive home. Not uncomfortable quiet, more like he was thinking hard about something. About halfway home, he started talking. He said watching his mom try to make those jokes with me just staring at her made him see how obvious the pattern was. For months, he'd been telling me that was just how his mom showed affection, that I should take it as a compliment that she was comfortable enough to tease me. But once I stopped reacting, he could see it wasn't teasing at all. It was just mean. He said he'd been making excuses because if he admitted his mom was being cruel, that meant admitting he'd let his wife suffer for 6 months. He said he was sorry he hadn't believed me sooner, sorry he'd made me feel like I was being too sensitive, sorry he'd even made me apologize to his mom that one time. I didn't say much, just listened to him work through it out loud. He said from now on he wasn't going to let his mom make those jokes anymore, that he was done pretending it was just her way of showing love. The next Sunday dinner happened 4 days later. Linda was different from the minute we walked in. She was quiet, almost subdued. She hugged Jake and Amy normally, but when I came in, she just nodded at me. Dinner conversation was weird because Linda kept starting to say something and then stopping herself. Finally, she made a half-hearted joke about how I'd parked too close to the mailbox. I gave her the stare, held it for 3 seconds, then turned to Caleb and asked about the cabinet. Linda's face went red, but she didn't try again. The rest of dinner she stuck to safe topics like the weather and what everyone wanted for Christmas. Amy told me later that Sienna had called Linda during the week, and apparently it hadn't been a pleasant conversation. 2 weeks went by with Sunday dinners that felt almost normal. Linda would ask me polite questions about work, and I'd give polite answers. She'd comment on the food or the weather, and I'd agree. She never made a single joke about my appearance or my job or anything personal. It was like she'd been replaced by this careful version of herself who was scared to say the wrong thing. I didn't engage warmly with her, but I wasn't cold either. I just stayed alert, watching for any sign she was testing whether she could go back to the old pattern. Jake noticed too. He told me his mom had asked him if I was still mad at her, and he'd told her I probably just needed time to trust that she wasn't going to start making mean jokes again. The third Sunday in December came around, and I could tell Linda was getting tired of walking on eggshells. We were halfway through dinner when she said something about how my Christmas bonus must be nice, since my job was so easy compared to real careers. I stopped with my fork halfway to my mouth and just looked at her. 5 seconds of complete silence while everyone else froze. Then I turned to Amy and asked how her apartment search was going. Before Amy could answer, Jake jumped in. He said his job in consulting wasn't exactly curing cancer either, so maybe we could all stop acting like some jobs were more important than others. His voice was casual but firm, making it clear he wasn't asking. Linda's whole face turned red. Not embarrassed red, angry red. She opened her mouth like she was going to argue, but Amy immediately launched into this long story about apartments she'd been looking at. Caleb asked Jake about his recent project at work. I went back to eating while Linda sat there realizing her son had just shut her down in front of everyone. She looked at Jake like she couldn't believe he'd contradicted her, but he just kept talking to his dad about work like nothing had happened. The rest of dinner, Linda barely spoke. When we left, she didn't do her usual thing of walking us to the door with final comments. She just said goodbye from the kitchen. Christmas Eve came and Linda's whole extended family showed up. Linda was sweet as pie to me from the moment I walked in. She complimented my dress, asked about my holiday plans, wanted to know if I'd gotten all my shopping done. Every word sounded fake, like she was performing for an audience. She kept glancing at Sienna while she talked to me, making sure her sister saw how nice she was being. I answered her questions politely but didn't match her energy. When she asked if I wanted more wine, I said no thank you without smiling. When she said my earrings were pretty, I said thanks and turned to talk to someone else. She was trying so hard to show everyone that we were fine now, that she was a good mother-in-law, but I wasn't going to help her pretend. At the end of the night, Linda came over with her arms out for a hug. I let her hug me but kept my arms at my sides, just accepting it without hugging her back. She held on for an extra second like she was waiting for me to respond, and when I didn't, she pulled back with this tight smile. She said she hoped I had a wonderful Christmas, and I said you too in this flat voice that made it clear I wasn't buying the act. Jake took my hand and we headed out to the car. Behind us, I heard Sienna say something to Linda in a low voice, but I couldn't make out the words. New Year's came and went without any family dinners, which gave me 2 weeks of breathing room before the pattern started up again. Jake and I went to his parents' house on January 2nd for leftover turkey sandwiches and board games, and Linda was careful the whole time. She asked about my holiday, complimented the scarf I was wearing, and didn't make a single joke at my expense. I stayed polite but distant, answering her questions without offering extra conversation. When we left, Jake said his mom seemed like she was really trying, and I told him one good day didn't erase 6 months of cruelty. He squeezed my hand and said he understood. The call from Amy came on a Tuesday evening while I was making dinner. My phone lit up with her name, and I almost didn't answer because I was in the middle of chopping vegetables, but something made me wipe my hands and pick up. She started talking before I could even say hello, her words coming out fast like she'd been rehearsing them. She said she'd been thinking about all those Sunday dinners, about sitting there watching her mother make mean jokes while she just laughed uncomfortably or changed the subject. She said she was sorry for never calling it out, for treating it like it was normal family teasing when it clearly wasn't. Her voice got thick and she said watching me shut down and refuse to engage had taught her something important about boundaries. She said sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is just refuse to participate in your own mistreatment, and she wished she'd learned that lesson sooner, so she could have stood up for me. I stood there in my kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear, vegetables forgotten on the cutting board, and felt something tight in my chest finally loosen. I told her I appreciated the call, that it meant a lot to hear her say those things out loud. She said she was going to do better, that she wasn't going to let her mom get away with that stuff anymore. We talked for 20 more minutes about other things, normal sister-in-law stuff about her apartment search and my upcoming project at work, and when we hung up, I felt lighter than I had in months. Sunday dinner the next week fell on January 15th, and I walked into Linda's house expecting the usual careful politeness she'd been showing lately. We made it through the appetizers and most of the main course without incident. Linda asked Jake about work, complimented Amy's new haircut, and told Caleb about a woodworking magazine she'd picked up for him. Then she looked at me and said something about my hair looking different, asked if I'd gotten it cut again, and added that it was interesting how some styles just don't work on certain face shapes. The words hung in the air for maybe 2 seconds before Caleb put down his fork. He looked right at Linda and said that comment was unkind and unnecessary. His voice was calm but firm, the way you'd correct a child who'd said something rude without realizing it. Linda's whole face went still. She stared at her husband like he'd just spoken a foreign language, her mouth opening slightly in shock. Caleb had never contradicted her in front of the family, had spent decades being the quiet one who let her run the show. She tried to laugh it off, waving her hand and saying she was just teasing, that I knew she didn't mean anything by it. But Caleb didn't smile or back down. He said she'd been teasing me exclusively for months while never making similar jokes about Amy or Jake. He said he'd watched it happen at every dinner and stayed quiet because he didn't want to cause problems, but staying quiet had let the problems get worse. The dining room went completely silent. Amy stopped eating mid-bite. Jake sat frozen with his water glass halfway to his mouth. Linda looked around the table like she was expecting someone to jump in and defend her, to tell Caleb he was overreacting. Nobody did. Amy set down her fork and said she'd noticed the same thing. She said watching Linda target me week after week had made her uncomfortable, and she was sorry she hadn't said something sooner. Jake nodded and added that his mom only seemed to tease people she thought wouldn't push back, and that wasn't actually teasing at all. Linda's eyes filled with tears. She pushed her chair back from the table and said she couldn't believe they were all attacking her like this, that she'd always shown love through humor, and now everyone was acting like she was some kind of monster. Her voice got high and shaky, and she said if they were going to gang up on her in her own home, she wasn't going to sit there and take it. She stood up and walked out of the dining room into the kitchen. We all heard the back door open and close. For about 30 seconds, nobody moved or spoke. Then Amy reached over and squeezed my hand under the table. Jake looked at his dad and said he was sorry it took him so long to see what was happening. Caleb shook his head and said the apology should go to me, not to him. We sat there in this weird frozen moment where everyone was looking at their plates or at each other, waiting to see what would happen next. Part of me expected someone to get up and go after Linda, to smooth things over like the family always did when she got upset. But nobody moved. Amy started talking about her apartment search again, her voice a little too bright, and we all grabbed onto the conversation like a lifeline. We talked about square footage and parking and neighborhood coffee shops while Linda's empty chair sat there reminding us what had just happened. 10 minutes passed before we heard the back door open again. Linda came back into the dining room with red eyes and blotchy cheeks. She sat down in her chair without looking at anyone and picked up her fork. Her hands were shaking slightly as she cut a piece of chicken. We finished dinner in near silence except for a few safe comments about the weather and Jake's upcoming work trip. Linda didn't make any jokes or comments about anyone. When Amy mentioned she was thinking about getting a dog, Linda just nodded instead of launching into a story or offering advice. When Caleb asked if anyone wanted coffee, Linda said no thank you in this small voice that didn't sound like her at all. Jake and I left right after we helped clear the table. Normally, Linda would walk us to the door and make some final comment about seeing us next week or teasing Jake about something. This time she stayed in the kitchen loading the dishwasher while Caleb walked us out. He told us to drive safe and gave me this look that seemed like an apology and a promise at the same time. 2 weeks went by before the next Sunday dinner. Jake asked me 3 times if I wanted to skip it, said we could tell his parents we had other plans if I wasn't ready. But I told him I wanted to go, that I wasn't going to let Linda's bad behavior keep me away from the rest of his family. We showed up at 5:30 like always. Linda opened the door and invited us in with this stiff smile that didn't reach her eyes. We made it through appetizers and most of dinner with polite small talk that felt forced and uncomfortable. Then Linda set down her water glass and looked at me. She said she wanted to apologize for her teasing. She said she hadn't realized it was hurtful, and she'd be more careful going forward about what she said. The words came out formal and rehearsed, like she'd practiced them in the mirror. She didn't say she was sorry for targeting me specifically, or for 6 months of cruel jokes disguised as humor. She didn't acknowledge that she'd made every family dinner miserable, or that she'd tried to play victim when her own family called her out. She just said she'd be more careful, like the problem was accidentally hurting my feelings instead of deliberately trying to make me feel small. I looked at her across the table and said thank you. Just those 2 words, flat and neutral. Then I nodded once and turned to Amy to ask about the apartment she'd finally decided on. Linda sat there clearly waiting for me to say more, to tell her it was okay, or that I forgave her, or that we could start fresh. I didn't give her any of that. I kept my face calm and my voice polite, but I didn't offer the reassurance she was fishing for. If she wanted to rebuild trust, she was going to have to do it through consistent changed behavior over time, not through one awkward apology that barely acknowledged what she'd actually done. The next few weeks fell into a new rhythm. We still went to Sunday dinners, but the whole dynamic had shifted. Linda was noticeably careful about what she said to me. She'd ask about my week at work without adding any commentary about how easy my job must be. She'd comment on my outfit without adding anything about my body. A few times she slipped back into old patterns, starting to make a borderline comment about my cooking or my appearance. But the second I gave her that silent stare, she'd catch herself and change direction mid-sentence. She'd turn the almost joke into a compliment, or just trail off and start talking about something else. Amy and Jake both noticed. Amy told me later that watching her mom scramble to course correct every time I gave her the look was actually kind of satisfying. Jake said his dad had mentioned that Linda complained about walking on eggshells around me now. Caleb had apparently told her that she'd created this situation by spending 6 months making cruel jokes, and now she had to live with the consequences of damaged trust. Jake said hearing his dad say that out loud had felt good, like someone was finally naming the reality everyone had been dancing around. By the time March rolled around, family dinners felt almost normal. Linda stuck to safe topics and genuine compliments. She joked with Amy and Jake the way she always had, with warmth and affection that made everyone laugh comfortably. She didn't joke with me that way, and I was fine with that. I'd rather have honest distance than fake warmth covering cruelty. Easter dinner came around in April with extended family showing up again. I walked into Linda's house bracing myself for potential awkwardness, but Linda maintained appropriate behavior the whole afternoon. She complimented the dessert I brought without any hidden digs. She asked about my recent promotion with what seemed like genuine interest. She made jokes with other family members that landed well because they weren't mean-spirited or targeted. Sienna watched everything carefully from across the room. I caught her eye a few times and she'd give me this small nod of approval. After dinner, when people were standing around drinking coffee and eating leftover ham sandwiches, Sienna came over to where I was standing by the kitchen window. She said she was proud of me for not letting Linda's cruelty continue. She said she'd talked to Linda several times since Thanksgiving about how she'd been treating me, and Linda had insisted everyone was overreacting. Sienna said watching Linda have to actually change her behavior, because I refused to accept the mistreatment, had been eye-opening. She told me that sometimes the only way to deal with someone who uses humor as a weapon is to refuse to react the way they want. She said bullies need an audience and a victim who plays along, and by taking away both of those things, I'd force Linda to either stop or look pathetic. We stood there talking for a few more minutes about other things, and when I left that night, I realized I'd actually enjoyed the dinner. Not because Linda and I were suddenly best friends, but because I'd spent the whole evening feeling safe instead of braced for attack. By late April, I started noticing something weird happening at Sunday dinners. I wasn't showing up with my shoulders already tight and my stomach in knots anymore. I'd walk into Linda's house and actually feel okay about being there. The constant bracing for impact had disappeared because there was nothing to brace for anymore. Linda stuck to safe topics and kept her distance, and honestly, that felt better than all those months of fake warmth covering up mean jokes. She'd ask me to pass the salt without any commentary about my eating habits. She'd mention the weather without comparing it to my mood or appearance. Sometimes she'd compliment something generic like my shoes or my hair, but it felt stiff and forced, like she was reading from a script someone had given her. I didn't push for more than that. Caleb had become surprisingly talkative with me, asking about my work projects and actually listening to my answers. Amy and I had started texting during the week about random stuff, sending each other funny videos or complaining about our days. The family dinners had transformed into something I could actually enjoy instead of endure. The first Sunday in May, Caleb decided to have a barbecue in his backyard instead of the usual indoor dinner. The weather was finally warm enough that we could eat outside on the patio he'd built himself years ago. Linda brought out potato salad and coleslaw, while Caleb stood at the grill flipping burgers and hot dogs. Amy showed up late carrying a pan of what she called her famous baked beans, which she set down on the outdoor table with this proud smile. Linda looked at the beans and said something about how Amy must have used the family recipe, but added her own special touch of burning them just a little. Everyone laughed, including Amy, who shoved her mom's shoulder playfully and said at least she tried, unlike some people who just bought potato salad from the store. Linda gasped in fake offense and admitted she absolutely had bought it from the deli section. The whole exchange felt light and easy and genuinely funny. Nobody's feelings got hurt. Nobody looked uncomfortable. Amy wasn't the target of cruelty disguised as jokes. This was just normal family teasing, the kind where everyone was in on it and nobody walked away feeling smaller. Linda never joked with me like that, and I realized sitting there watching them that I was completely fine with it. I didn't need Linda to tease me warmly or include me in her playful banter with her kids. I needed her to leave me alone, and she was doing exactly that. Peace felt better than forced closeness ever could. Later that night, after Jake and I got home, I sat on our couch thinking about the past year. All those months of trying to convince Jake his mom was being cruel. All those dinners where I'd laughed along hoping it would stop. All those conversations where I'd tried to explain why her jokes hurt. None of it had worked. But the silent treatment had forced everyone to actually see what was happening without me having to say a single word. Linda's cruelty had become impossible to ignore once I stopped reacting to it. Her jokes just hung there in the air looking mean and petty when nobody laughed or made excuses for them. I'd spent so much energy trying to prove I was mistreated, trying to win arguments about Linda's intentions, trying to make people understand. Turns out I didn't need to do any of that. I just needed to stop participating in my own mistreatment. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to play along.